welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Joining me on the line tonight is my good friend, Julien DeMarco. How are you, buddy?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Well, thanks for joining me again. Tonight is a Paul Bunyan edition. I got my beard, man. I gotta trim this thing. I've been down COVID lockdown and my razor broke down, and so I have to go buy a new one. So I'm looking pretty rugged tonight. So I want to just excuse myself to the audience here. I'm gonna be cleaned up by the next time I do a cast here. But so Julien, let me set up this question here for you because I got in a conversation with a good friend of mine a couple of nights ago about the idea of governance and, how we're to structure civilization and he's a good friend of mine. He's a classical liberal friend of mine. He's very smart. And we were going back and forth because more and more classical liberals, more and more conservatives are frustrated with the state of politics today in America as we see this perpetual shift to the left in America with governance, right? And, I proposed several ideas, the first of which, the notion of limited government, first of all, came from the old world. It worked really well in the Catholic world, proposed by the likes of, I believe, St. Thomas Aquinas. We call that subsidiarity. In the old world, we come to the new world. Not only do we separate the moral law from the economic law, but we also separate, again, the monarchy from subsidiarity. And I proposed an idea to my friend saying, the idea of limited government was always a fairy tale in America. It was never going to work because the founding fathers separated the lock and the key, the mechanisms to keep government small. The first of which is the moral law. Second of all, guess what? The kingdoms oftentimes are broken down into smaller provinces. Subsidiarity could work in countries that were generally much smaller regionally, that were more homogenous in culture and more homogenous in faith. And that's why limited government worked. And I threw at him the notion of what Charles Columbus said, the idea that, human civilization and government is dictated by the basic premise of you have the governed and the governed. You cannot have an idea of a small government per se, especially in post-Enlightenment society, especially after the 19th and 20th century, as we saw these big nation states sort of put together by revolutionary forces of liberalism in many ways. And I suggested that liberalism presents us with a scenario where we're all going to have to accept strong centralized governments. There's no going back to that world with the current liberal regimes that dominate society. He pressed me back and forth a little bit. I said, okay, give me one example where limited government in post-Enlightenment society has ever worked. And he stopped back and he couldn't think of one, of course, Julien. And he said to me, well, give me one example where strong centralized government has worked. And I said, Christendom. Christendom worked for 1600 years, whatever it was. And he said to me in response, he said, so you want to send everybody back to serfdom so we can all live in poverty? Julien, is that what the old world was? Is that what Christendom was? Is that what monarchy was? Basically, we're all a bunch of serfs living hand to mouth, day to day, without any future, where liberalism really elevated us into this class system that's much more fluid, where we can all climb up the economic engine of prosperity and live the good life, Julien. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a straw man argument. That's not really there's so many things wrong with that argument that it needs to be picked apart a lot. Because one, everybody all over the world has lived hand to mouth. That's typically how humans have always lived. When we became a settled agricultural society, even when we were a nomadic people, we lived hand to mouth. That has nothing really to do with the form of government and everything to do with just the nature of the world. As you pointed out, as Charles Columbus has mentioned, you will always have a small minority that rule and the majority that is ruled. What makes one different from the other is the nature of that rulership. And as he puts it, He would rather be ruled by somebody who believes he will fry in hell forever if he rules me poorly, as opposed to somebody who just sees me as an economic cow to be milked and then put out to pasture when I'm no longer useful. Again, the monarch, God's anointed, is the ontological representation of God's authority on earth in person. And yes, this we are making a religious claim, because monarchy inherently is religious by its very function, whether it be pagan, Buddhist, Shinto, Catholic, Protestant, Egyptian, whatever have you. Monarchy by its very nature is religious because the king is the physical manifestation of God's authority on earth. That's why he is called God's anointed. That's why it is to judge the king and to judge. You can criticize the king and his policies, but to criticize his person, to criticize his rule, to criticize the form of government is to criticize God at the same time, because God has given him authority to rule over the kingdom, over that piece of land that king rules over. And so there's that whole religious element to it. As this whole idea about serfdom and this whole idea of economics, you also have to understand that the modern world, whether it be America or whether it be Europe, where there are republics, but not all of them are republic, not all of Europe is a republic, there are still monarchies left. That's Britain, Spain, Monaco, all the Netherlands, Belgium, Scandinavia, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg. All of these things that your friend is talking about all got their start under monarchy. I'm sure he's gone to the post office. The whole idea of the post office, that came from monarchy. This whole idea that you have intrinsic rights that are granted to you not from the government but from God comes from monarchy, because as at a certain period in time, under when we were a much more overtly religious society, there weren't rights that could be taken away from you or rights that was granted to you by the king. These rights were granted to you because of the fact that you existed and the fact that you were a child of God. These ideas of the government granting you rights, that's an entirely Republican notion. And this idea that you have inalienable rights, that's a Republican political framework and concept and philosophy. Monarchy and its political foundations and its philosophy does not operate in this idea of granting people rights or taking things away. It operates in this naturalistic setting of, because you have a family, a powerful family, the royal family, that in a sense is the main family, which is why they're the royal family, and the rest of the country is part of the extended family, if you will.
But
And
why
so
does that
what
one family have such privilege over anybody else? Aren't all men created equal?
Well, that's a lie. Nobody is created equal in shape, size, or in talent, or any type of thing. I'm sure. I'm sure. Just look at yourself and your own life and your own family. Whether you have particular talents that your wife will never be able to achieve, and she has talents that you will never be able to achieve. Your own children have talents that you might not be able to achieve. Your children have talents that one or the other won't be able to achieve. No man on earth is equal. That's a fallacy. We are all, the only thing that is equal, the only thing that makes us equal is that we are all born, excuse my language, in piss and shit. That's it. Other than that, everybody else is different. We all have different abilities, different head starts in life. Nobody is equal except from the fact that we are born messy.
But
That's
it,
it. That's where the equality begins and ends. This
but in
idea that we are all equal is just a fallacy.
but in terms of governance, why should one man have the right to rule over other men in that sense?
Um, what do you mean by that? What is the? Can you repeat the question in a different
Well,
way?
I think where classical liberals will get terribly uncomfortable is the fact that we all are individuals, right? We may have some differences, and they will tell you we all have differences. Some have greater skills than other. We are a merit-based system. But in terms of and in terms of human dignity, we're all equal. But in terms of governance, they would argue that no one man has a right to govern over another man. Our affairs as
So
individuals.
let me ask you this: why is it sacrosanct that everybody has a right to the franchise, to universal suffrage? What makes that so sacrosanct, so
They will
special?
say
Where,
God. That's
where is
God-given right.
so where a God given right? Where is that given in any of the traditions of Christianity or in the Bible? Where does God say that women can vote, that men can vote, that everything should be put up for a vote? Because what I see in the Bible is I see that that God says in in the Bible, honor how does the saying go? Honor the king. Yes, he explicitly tells you to honor the king. Or in another line, Jesus explicitly says, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar, give unto God what is God." Jesus does not say that you should not, you should just overthrow Caesar because he's not Catholic or he's not Christian. You shouldn't worship Caesar as a god, but you should pay your taxes. You should give due respect because his authority comes from a higher being that isn't you. His authority comes from God, and you should respect his authority. The authority comes from the top, it does not come from the bottom. So, again, I ask this question. Uh, Liberals can say it comes from God, but from a historical standpoint, that doesn't bear out at all.
Okay. Okay. And so I guess what the classical liberals say in rebuttal to that is where does it state and how do we know who the rightful authority is? And by what claim, what proof do we have that this one man or this one family was anointed by God? I mean, God may have can't come to me, Julian, has spoken to me and told me, hey, I'm my own authority, like we Americans believe, individual rights, right?
Well, I again that gets into like the weeds. That's a very individualistic way of viewing things. Look,
Right.
if everybody is sovereign, then nobody is sovereign. Somebody always has authority over someone. If you are a child, your parents have authority over you. And if you have a job, if you have a job and you're not the CEO, somebody has authority over you. You cannot run a okay, like if you have a for example, let me put this in like a little bit more modern terms. A company cannot, the employees do not run the company. Somebody at the end of the day has to be in charge and make the decisions and the way that the company is going to go. Now, he can ask the employees what they would like, but at the end of the day, he makes the final decision, and that's that. You don't ask the students at the high school, well, what do you want? Well, like, what should we teach you? Most of the people, if in a public school setting, even at a private school setting, most of these kids will say, oh, well, we just want to be able to play video games or run outside or whatever.
Well, I think
This is what you have on a global scale, is basically telling people, tell it is the children running the shop. You cannot, that's not how society works. There is the parent, there is the one that is in charge, and there is the one that listens. But now that doesn't mean you need to be a tyrant. That does not mean you need to just govern unadvised and just not have any input from the people that you're ruling over. But to say that to give this notion that their say is is all be all and sacrosanct is absolutely ridiculous. And also this idea that somehow 51% of the majority is somehow a litmus test for for the general public. We all know that not everybody votes. Not everybody votes, and not everybody can vote. So that right there, it's a fake cover that said, oh, well, 51% of the people said that they wanted this. Well, that doesn't actually take in the whole entire population, because some people they didn't vote. Some people can't vote for legal reasons or for age reasons. So to use this as a litmus test for the basis of legality, I think is absolutely, it's fundamentally flawed.
But why would you want to take us back to a world where tyrants govern over our lives, and what ingenuity, freedom, the comforts of life were suppressed, Julian, weren't they?
We have to work. We also have to understand definition. The concept of tyrant has changed. This broadening of tyranny or tyrant is being ever expanded in the liberal sense from liberals, classical liberals, Republicans, Democrats, progressives. They're all they're all cousins and children of incestuous children of one another. But this idea, if you look at the 20th century, what do you see? You see tyrant after tyrant after tyrant, and none of them are kings. All of them came about in a liberal Republican setting, whether it's socialist, communist, Marxist, whatever have you. And look at Venezuela. Look at Africa. Look at all the Latin countries that have strongmen. Do you see any of them with the title of king? No, you see them being president. In my experience, alive right now, and from a historical understanding, especially of the last century, most, if not almost all, of the tyrants were of a liberal bent. So you can say, oh, well, they're that. No, liberalism, communism, socialism, Marxism, classical liberalism, democracy, republicanism, progressivism, leftism, they're all the same. They are all anti-traditional authority. They are all birthed out of the Enlightenment. You can say, this form of liberalism is better than this form of liberalism, but ultimately, one form of liberalism gives birth to the other form in its extreme version. So you have to accept that. You cannot say, oh, well, socialism is something else. Yeah, well, classical liberalism gave you socialism. Classical liberalism gave you Marxism. Classical liberalism gave you communism. Classical liberalism gave you progressivism. Classical liberalism gave you leftism. They all stem from the same grandparent. Well, you cannot disown these people. They are all of the same thing.
I think the pushback would be that when we look at the American Revolution, it was a liberal revolution designed to bring about not only equality, but also the sharing of ideas of freedoms, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right?
So the American Revolution, they didn't want to pay for a tax for the war that was fought to keep them protected. So the British Empire fights for the colony, and so when the British taxpayer doesn't want to pay for the colony's upkeep, and then the British Parliament, not the king, the Parliament, puts the tax burden on the colonists. Now all of a sudden the colonists are like, no, we don't want this. Wait, so you're going to benefit from the protection of the most powerful empire in the world, and then when they say, yeah, well, here's the bill for what we just did for you, you want to get all uppity and throw a tantrum and throw tea in the harbor.
Right. But I think the classical liberals would say that really the essence of the classical liberal revolution, the American Revolution was about freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, where today's progressive movement, you really can't blame that on classical liberals in the founding because they're anti-liberal now, right? There's some kind of quasi-Marxist movement that wants to shut
What do they
down
mean?
all this.
What do they mean by anti-liberal? I really don't understand what they
Well, I
mean.
mean,
What
if
do
you
they
look
mean
at
by
the university
anti-liberal?
campuses, they're shutting down speakers there. They're attacking religious liberty all over the place. They're, the woke
Well, I mean,
culture now.
how is that any different than the so-called American Revolution, where they made Catholicism illegal? They granted at this they granted they simultaneously at the same time made Catholicism to practice Catholicism throughout the whole entire colonies, but at the same time they made it illegal. Where in Maryland, Catholicism was legal. It wasn't It wasn't legal. It wasn't legal to practice or evangelize in other parts of the state. Oh, well, not states, well, colonies that ended up becoming the states. But in Maryland, hence why it's called Maryland, Catholicism was legal. And let's not forget some of the outlandish crimes against the King George III. For Catholics, this should be a sticking point for them, is that the revolutionaries had an issue with the Quebec Act. And so one of the crimes against King George is that he's a papist. So from a Catholic standpoint, I really don't see it as a positive check mark for the revolutionaries. For me personally, whether I was Catholic or not, the so-called slandering of King George III and calling him a papist, I would still say that was a check mark against the revolutionaries, even if I wasn't Catholic, because it makes no sense on the basis of their argument against him, because
Right.
what they're screaming about has absolutely no ill bearing against how the colonies were governed.
But
it's just a bunch of Protestants who only want their freedom of religion, but nobody else's freedom of religion.
yeah, I think the American founding at its origins was a spillover of the Protestant Revolution from Europe. But I think what the classical liberals say is, why would you want to go back to a system of serfdom and sort of feudal economic policies that left most people poor?
But the thing is, though, serfdom was outlawed. Serfdom was already abolished come the 1700s. So, even before that, serfdom had ended in England hundreds of years ago. Again, we have to get our terms right, our times right, our definitions right. When classical liberals or anybody who is saying, "Oh, you want to return us to the days of serfdom," well, what do you mean by serfdom? Because in the 1600s, in the 1700s, and even in the 1500s, serfdom wasn't a thing. If you're talking about the early 1400s before the Black Death, then yeah, serfdom existed then. But after the Black Death and in the 1500s and in the 1600s and the 1700s, serfdom for the majority of Europe was outlawed and abolished and was a thing of the past. So I can't argue against something that doesn't exist when classical liberalism is in its ascendancy, because it's a non sequitur. It's not an art. It's not something that exists. So you can't use that as a sticking point against the old world or the old regime, because it didn't exist. And it also, mind you, it was these people that abolished it themselves. So if you're going to say that these people are bad, well, if they're so bad, why they get rid of it? And why they get rid of it without having a violent revolution? So again, you can't make the argument and say that these people are bad when they are reformers and liberators and heralded as such.
Yeah, I think there is something to, and this is just my opinion here, You know, in the Catholic Church, we have something called development of doctrine, right? Things reveal itself after in time and space. I think history evolves that way too. I think one of the advantages that classical liberals had in many respects is after they revolted, they took over what was a fairly healthy civilization from Christendom. Christendom, on the other hand, had to convert really a pagan continent all over Europe, and it was much more complex. You take away modern technologies like mass communication, mass travel. It took time for a lot of these ideas to develop, even if there was principles of serfdom and oppression in many ways. You see, again, the church moving away from that, and we're advancing into better ideas, better rights, better understanding of moral principles in that way. So I think you're right when you say we got to pick a time and date and understand what the circumstances were. And just as liberalism continues to evolve, and I would argue it's evolved for the worse, Christianity, on the other hand, was evolving for what was better at the time, and adjustments via economics, private property rights, all that stuff was being figured out up until the Grand Revolutions, right?
I would say that's a pretty accurate statement that in your opinion, yes. Again, you know, if we want to, I don't want to, again, I already made this about the whole serfdom thing being a non sequitur, but even still, one of the things with serfs is that they had land that they tilled and worked, and they also weren't able to be thrown off the land, and they also had a place to stay and live. Yes, they couldn't necessarily go and become lawyers and doctors and all these other things, but again, you're dealing with a society that is content. It's not the society doesn't have this psyche, this mythos that you can become anything that you want. We live in a society where we're told from birth to death that you can become anything you want, which again is a fallacy. For most of us, no, we can't. And we should be content with that. And that's okay. Not all of us are going to become doctors and lawyers and presidents. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with just staying where you're at.
But doesn't that attitude slow down progress and advancement and humanity getting better at everything we've done?
No, it doesn't. Because if that was the case, then we wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be talking to you over the internet, and you living in a whole nother state on the other side of the country.
But liberalism gave us all that, right?
No, it didn't. What gave us that was human progress and wanting to advance forward. It had nothing. If anything, if you look at the old world, if you look at monarchs, they were always patrons of the latest scientific trend, the latest fashion, arts, what have you. They made sure that their courts were filled with the greatest artisans, scientists, excuse me, and tastemakers and all of that to not only to enhance their court, but to also better their realm. Progress is going to happen regardless of the form of government. Again, this idea, some governments stifle progress, yes, and some governments allow it to flourish. But as you had already pointed out, and as I pointed out earlier, classical liberalism or republics, whether it be the United States or any other republic that have you in Europe, they are building on top of they built on top of an already healthy society and government apparatus. They didn't actually build any of these things from the bottom up. They just ran in, shot everybody, stole everybody's property, declared the old form illegal and abolished, and then set up shop. That's all they did. They didn't make any of this stuff themselves.
Well, I think the counter rebuttal to that would be is that unleashing the individual ingenuity and the motivations to become wealthy, the competitive notion of the markets is what has advanced us this far, Julien. If we were still back in that,
So basically, we're making everybody a number, and basically making them a soulless, atomized automaton that has no actual intrinsic value other than the economic input that they can put out. That seems like a very dull and boring life to me.
yeah, well, they would say that's why we got all the goodies and the comforts and the pleasures that we have.
That seems like an endless materialism. That doesn't seem like a very healthy thing to me. Now, like, I personally like the goodies and all these other things, but there's also other things besides the goodies. And the old world understood that.
Yeah.
The old world was content. Now, I'm not saying that, people in the old world didn't want to become something other than a farmer or something like that, but this idea wasn't pounded in the mental psyche. It wasn't in the water, if you will, that anybody and everybody could become whatever you wanted. You couldn't tell some peasant farmer that, oh yeah, you could grow up and become king. No, you can't, because the king is the king, and his family is his eldest son or his youngest brother or his cousin or whoever's next in line is going to become the king. But you tell your child, you tell your child that he can become president.
Okay.
And then when he doesn't become president, or he doesn't become a doctor, or he doesn't, soar the skies and, climb mountains, what do you think that does to your child? What do you think that does to the psyche of a population when they're told they can become all these things and then they never do?
Okay, so let's stop for a moment here and talk about culture and family in that world as we start to wrap it up here. One of the things I'm reading is because these old kingdoms of old were more religious, homogenous cultures, we've had all kinds of discrimination that have existed. I'm currently reading a book by Renzo Di Felice on Jews in fascist Italy and the entire battle that the Jews has faced historically and the anti-Semitism that they faced, right? Liberalism has really opened up the path to pluralism, tolerance, diversity. Weren't these kingdoms and these homogenous cultures really oppressing certain minorities there? And wasn't really life boring and old, and people really had really nothing going on? It was a boring and dull life, wasn't it?
Well, what do you mean by tolerant? Because do you mean tolerant in a 21st century standard, or do you mean tolerant for, say, the 1500s or the 1600s? What do you mean by tolerant? Because, again, if a country is homogenous and doesn't want people that aren't part of that culture living and coming in, why does somebody from some other culture or from some other country, nobody has a right to enter into another country and just set up shop?
Yeah, I think they would say that some of those people who were always there, unfortunately, they became minorities. And so when you push them out of a homogenous culture.
Based off of what? I mean, if we're gonna, let's stick with Jews, for example. Jews are a nomadic tribe, right?
Right.
So Jews are always going to one country to other. If the vast majority of those people who are native, even when they weren't Christian, they were pagan or whatever the case may be, and the Jews just lived in their little enclaves, then the vast majority of those people become Christian. And then, again, how is that any different from them being pagan? I'm sure the pagans in those areas put the Jews in those conclaves to begin with, and they regulated what the Jews could do. How is that any different?
But didn't liberalism solve that problem by giving us religious liberty so we can all live in harmony, so nobody has to be kicked out of any lands and be oppressed?
Well, I mean, I'm still trying to understand, what do you mean by tolerance and oppression and religious tolerance? I mean, if Jews are able to live in the country unmolested and practice their faith, I don't see how that isn't tolerant.
Well, there has been times, Julian, where were the homogenous culture, and the kings brought down the hammer and pushed a few of them out, right?
And that's a problem. How? I'm failing to see the problem here.
Well, it's just basic human dignity, basic human rights, right?
There's no such thing as basic human rights. There's no such thing as basic human rights, and there's no such thing as universal human rights. These things don't exist. Nobody has a right to go into another country, and nobody has a right to say I can live here and I can practice my faith here. If you're not from that country, if you're not part of the dominant culture, and the dominant culture doesn't want you there, and the ruler of that country doesn't want you there, you don't have a right to be there. I'm sorry, but them's the berries. That's just how it works.
Well, okay, all right. I think classical liberals saying you're being very mean-spirited by you discriminating.
Big deal. A big deal. Like, it just again, if I say this as a minority, like, and I would, if I was told that I had to leave this country along with everybody else that's part of my minority, I wouldn't like it. But that would be understandable. But then again, that's not happening. That's not the world that we live in. But the world that they are living in, which is a religious one, and these people are of a different religious makeup. If it is causing a problem with a homogeneous society, and the homogeneous society wants to remain homogeneous and copacetic, I see no reason why, if religion is the crux of the issue, why they can't be moved out of the country. Now, I understand that, in our 21st century sensibilities, that is uncomfortable, but back then, that was not uncomfortable for them. We have to understand what is uncomfortable for us may not have been uncomfortable for them.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'm going to give you the last word tonight, Julien. The old world versus the new world. I think with liberals being very confused about the state of the West as it heads further and further to the left, they're beginning to question a lot of things. I think they struggle looking at the past because they've been so convinced about these revolutionary ideas that we've all bought, that it's got to work within that framework for civilization to make any justice. But tonight, I'm going to call this Julien's rant on the old world. I think when I label this thing and post it up on YouTube, my friend, I want to thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, I want to thank my friend Julien DeMarco for a wonderful rant tonight. He gave you his take. If you disagree with Julien, put it in the comment section. Let's get a discussion going. I think that'd be wonderful. Once again, this is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.